The Loch Lomond in Trossachs National Park covers the scenic area where the lowlands meets the highlands. The origins of Luss are uncertain. In the late 1700s, much of the village was rebuilt by the local landowners, the Cahoons, to house workers from their nearby slate quarries. The quarries were closed many years ago, but the neat rows of slate workers' cottages still flank the main route from the heart of the village to the pier. Luss is almost completely enclosed to the west by a series of steep, attractive conical peaks, but it is a spectacular view of Lomond, rising proudly from the opposite side of the loch, that will remain with you, one of Scotland's iconic views. Luss has been used in quite a few films. Most notably, it was used as a fictional village of Glendarach, take the high road, and the gift shop here was used as a village shop. As the day wore on, the car parks started to get a lot busier, and the tourists started heading towards the loch. The pier is the main attraction for many of the visitors. In Lomond, Scotland's most southerly Munro dominates the scene to the northeast. From here, visitors can catch one of the many water bus services that connect to Inchcailloch, Ballach and Balmaha. There are loch cruises to discover the many islands in that part of the loch. Luss Pier is also an excellent place just to relax and chill out, to soak in the scenery and watch the constant coming and going. There are about 30 islands in Loch Lomond. Inchmurn, the most southerly, is by far the largest. In fact, it's the largest freshwater island in Britain. It even has a hotel in it. It also has a nudist colony. But with the weather we have in these wonderful isles, I don't imagine they get out much. A horse and trap was in hand for those wishing to travel in style. There's a car park just off the A82, about 4.5 miles south of Crianlarich, to the Falls of Falach. The pool here is also known as Rob Roy's bathtub, though I'm not sure that he ever used it for bathing, although he may have used it to shake off pursuing soldiers. 2 miles further down the glen, we arrive at the Drovers Inn at Inverglas. It was opened in 1705 and used by the many cattle drovers on their way to the markets of the south. Whether or not Rob Roy bathed in the waters behind the Falls of Falach, it would have been very surprising had he not frequented this inn. But the real draw of the drovers is that it's the most haunted inn in Britain, particularly room 6, with numerous ghostly sightings over the years. I was going to head south along the West Highland Way for a couple of miles to Knapmore, a hill overlooking Ardluey, for an excellent view of the north end of Loch Lomond. The West Highland Way is Scotland's best known long-distance path, a 96-mile-long gruelling hike from Mulgai in the outskirts of Glasgow to Fort William in the northwest. I had now almost reached the summit of this stretch of the walk, and the pointed peak of Lomond could just be made out in the distance ahead. As I rounded the ridge, Loch Lomond came into view. It's very narrow and almost fjord-like at its northern end. Illinavaux, one of its many islands, could easily be picked out. The West Highland Way continues south on the far side of the loch, never that far above the shoreline. It passes Rob Roy's Cave on its way to Inversnaid, which is just round from the first row of mountains to the left. This is a fine view of Loch Lomond, and it was certainly worth the walk. The highlands here, and the clans who inhabited them, were romanticised by writers like Sir Walter Scott, but they were a wild, unruly bunch, and woe betide anyone that dared enter their clan lands. The cattle drovers from the north and west were just as wild, but still had to pay for protection when entering clan lands. It was called blackmail. Their cattle were black back then. That's where the name blackmail originated. Ardluey sits at the mouth of the river Falach. There's not a great deal to Ardluey. It's actually stretching it to call it a village. It does have a station though, and an excellent hotel by the roadside. It was originally built as a hunting lodge for the Cahoon estate in the early 1800s. We used to stop here regularly for a coffee break when we weren't in a hurry. A short drive of 6 miles took me to the Tourist Information Centre at Inverglas. It is a very good cafe and clean toilets. The park have been installing quite a few viewpoints as part of the Scottish Scenic Routes project to enhance the visitor experience, and in 2015 the Inverglas pyramid was constructed. An entrance from the path gradually exposes the loch ahead. This is a similar idea as the viewpoints that were created in the Victorian times at Campbell and at the Brewer Falls. Directly across the loch from here is Inversnaid. The previous time we visited Inversnaid, I noticed a couple of people boarding a wee ferry to bring them across to here. The new viewpoint here is certainly a worthwhile addition and makes this stop a welcome detour for excellent views of the loch. It was the early evening by the time I had reached the pier at Tarbet, and the setting sun was casting its last rays, lighting up the rugged amphitheatre of peaks that enclose the east side of Tarbet Bay, while the berthed cruise ships bobbed about in the choppy waters of the loch. Their work was done for the day. Cruise ships have been plying the loch here since Victorian times, and it was my intention to catch one on the following day to discover the less visited northern end of the loch. The Gaelic name is in Tarbet, which actually originates from the Old Norse for draw boat. It was another glorious morning as I headed to Tarbet. There are quite a few cruise trips on offer from there, and I wanted to take the Inversnaid Explorer to visit the less visited northern part of the loch. The loch was a lot calmer than the previous night, and we were soon on our way. I had made this trip about 12 years ago with my wife Roberta and thoroughly enjoyed it. This was always McGregor land, and much of the history linked to the national park centres around Rob Roy. The upper deck was very busy, and there was hardly a breath of wind. A wonderful day for a sail. Inversnaid appeared just ahead in its wonderful setting of woodland and crag. We were now drawing into the pier. As we docked at Inversnaid, the boat was tied up at the pier and the passengers started to disembark. The first detour was to take a walk onto the small pier here to take in one of the finest views in the national park. On the opposite bank is the hamlet of Inverglas, surrounded by the most wonderful amphitheatre of rugged peaks. They are known as the Aracher Alps. The Aracher Alps consist of 3 Munros, Ben Narman to the left, Ben Vane to the right, and in between we have Benin. That view in itself is reason enough to make this trip. I struggled to tear myself away and headed over to the Arklet Falls. The view of the falls from the hotel grounds is curtailed a bit, but they are still very impressive. They tumble down from Loch Arklet in the heights above. It's about 150 metres above Loch Lomond. At the top of the steps, a small bridge is built over the falls, and I made my way across and over to the rocks on the other side of the upper falls. They were quite turbulent considering the good spell of weather we'd been having. I made my way back onto the path and headed for the bridge. The view of the falls from here was astounding. The noise was deafening. This bridge is on the route of the very popular long-distance walk, the West Highland Way. There's always a few walkers sitting at the outside patio area, refuelling and resting before setting off on the next part of their journey. As I headed back from the waterfall, I noticed a boat approaching to take us back to Tarbet, so I made my way down to the pier. The tourists that had travelled over with me were also heading down, and we queued to get back on board. With all the passengers on board, the safety chain was put back on, and we eased our way out onto the loch. It had certainly been a worthwhile trip. The boat docked, and the passengers disembarked. It was a most enjoyable trip.